A young British backpacker travels across the world searching for adventure. New countries, new experiences, new people. By December 2018, 22-year-old Grace Millane had reached New Zealand. Friends described her as bright, independent, confident and excited for the future. On the evening before her birthday, Grace arranged a Tinder date with a man she had never met before. CCTV footage later showed the pair laughing together inside bars in central Auckland, drinking, talking, kissing, appearing completely comfortable in each other's company. At 9:41 p.m, cameras captured Grace entering the lift of Auckland's CityLife Hotel beside the man she had spent the evening with. It would be the last confirmed footage of Grace alive. In the days that followed, investigators would uncover a hotel room hiding forensic evidence, internet searches about disposing of a body, a suitcase transported through the city, and a shallow grave hidden in woodland outside Auckland. But what shocked New Zealand most was not only the murder itself, it was the defence that followed. The man accused of killing Grace admitted she died in his apartment, but he claimed it happened accidentally during consensual, rough sex. What followed became one of the most controversial murder trials in modern New Zealand history, a case that ignited international debate around violence against women, victim blaming, online dating, and the growing use of the so-called rough sex defence in courtrooms around the world. Because for Grace Millane, danger didn't appear as somebody lurking in darkness. It appeared as somebody sitting across a table, sharing drinks, making conversation, and smiling for CCTV cameras. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm your host, Matt. You can find us on all the socials at What They Hide Pod. And if you'd like to support the podcast directly, the Buy Me a Coffee link is available in the description below. A huge thank you to everybody continuing to support the show, share the episodes, and help the podcast keep growing every week. Listener shout-outs will be at the end of today's episode. Before we begin, this episode contains discussion of murder, sexual violence, coercive behaviour, and themes some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Tonight, we travel to New Zealand to examine the murder of Grace Millane, a case that began as the disappearance of a young backpacker, before becoming one of the most disturbing and controversial murder investigations in modern New Zealand history. This is the story of Grace Millane. Grace Emmy Rose Millane was born in Essex, England, on the 2nd of December 1996. Friends and family described her as intelligent, warm, adventurous, and fiercely independent. She grew up in Whitford alongside her brothers, in a close family environment that would later become central to the emotional impact of the entire case. After studying advertising and marketing at the University of Lincoln, Grace graduated in 2018. Like many young people reaching the end of university life, she wanted to explore the world before settling into a career, and so she began planning a long solo backpacking journey. Throughout 2018, Grace travelled across multiple countries. Her social media showed beaches, mountains, city skylines, hostels, bars, and smiling photographs from across South America. Friends later said she embraced travelling completely, She appeared confident navigating unfamiliar places, open to meeting new people, excited by the independence that came with travelling alone. In November 2018, Grace arrived in New Zealand. The country had become one of the most popular destinations in the world for young British backpackers. Safe, friendly, beautiful landscapes, a place thousands of tourists travelled through every year without incident. Grace spent time exploring the North Island before eventually arriving in Auckland on the 30th of November 2018. By then, her 22nd birthday was only days away, and according to messages later examined during the investigation, Grace appeared happy, relaxed, still making plans for the future. She checked into accommodation in central Auckland and began exploring the city. Like many solo travellers, she also used dating apps while abroad, something investigators would later say played a central role in the events that followed. On the 1st of December, the night before her birthday, Grace arranged a Tinder date with a local man named Jesse Shane Kempson. At the time, there was nothing obviously alarming about the arrangement. Millions of people around the world use dating apps every single day. Meeting strangers for drinks had become completely normalised, routine, almost mundane. And that normality would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because as evening approached, Grace prepared for what appeared to be an ordinary night out in Auckland city centre. She had no way of knowing that within hours, an international murder investigation would begin forming around her final movements. On the evening of the 1st of December 2018, Auckland was alive with weekend crowds. Bars spilled music onto the streets, backpackers moved between restaurants and nightclubs, taxi lights reflected across rain-darkened roads in the city centre, and somewhere among thousands of people moving through downtown Auckland, Grace Millane was preparing to meet somebody she'd only spoke to online. The man waiting for her was 26-year-old Jesse Shane Kempson. The pair had connected through Tinder, and according to later evidence presented in court, their conversation beforehand appeared friendly and flirtatious. At first, the evening seemed completely ordinary. CCTV footage later reconstructed much of their day, almost minute by minute. Investigators would eventually piece together bar visits, timestamps, purchases, walking routes, and conversations witnessed by staff and customers. The footage showed Grace and Kempson drinking together in central Auckland bars, laughing, talking closely, kissing, at times appearing affectionate and relaxed. Nothing in the footage suggested visible fear or distress, and that would later become an important point during the trial. To outside observers, they looked like countless other couples meeting for drinks on a Saturday night. But while investigators would later spend years analysing the final hours of Grace's life, nobody around them that night realised they were watching the beginning of a murder investigation. As the evening continued, the pair moved between several venues in Auckland city centre. Witnesses later described them appearing comfortable together. Meanwhile, back in the United Kingdom, Grace's family had no reason to feel concerned. For them, Grace was simply travelling, exploring the world, living independently abroad. And because of the time difference between Britain and New Zealand, nobody yet realised those ordinary moments in Auckland would soon become internationally known. As midnight approached, the pair eventually returned towards the CityLife Hotel in central Auckland. At approximately 9:41 p.m, CCTV cameras captured Grace entering the hotel lift beside Kempson. The footage would later become some of the most recognisable imagery in the entire case. Grace can be seen smiling, calm, holding conversation naturally, showing no obvious signs of distress. For investigators, that footage became both crucial evidence and something emotionally difficult to watch. Because according to prosecutors, Grace was already entering the final hours of her life. Inside room 308 of the CityLife Hotel, the prosecution later argued the evening turned violent. Exactly what happened inside that apartment would become the centre of one of New Zealand's most controversial murder trials. At some point during the night, Grace died from pressure applied to her neck. Kempson would later admit Grace died in the room, but almost immediately, he began constructing an explanation investigators and prosecutors would fiercely challenge. He claimed Grace's death had been accidental, the result of consensual rough sex. That claim would later ignite international debate, but according to prosecutors, the evidence told a very different story. Pathology findings later suggested sustained pressure to the neck, significant force, and injuries consistent with restraint. The prosecution argued Grace had not died accidentally. They argued she had been murdered. But what shocked investigators most was not only what they believed happened inside the apartment, it was what allegedly happened afterwards. Because according to the prosecution timeline, while Grace's body remained inside the hotel room, Kempson began searching online for ways to dispose of her body, locations to bury remains, and methods of concealment. And then, in one of the most disturbing details of the entire case, investigators alleged he arranged another Tinder date with a different woman, while Grace lay dead inside the apartment. Outside the hotel, Auckland continued moving normally through the night. Traffic passed through the city, music played in bars, people laughed in restaurants and clubs, and hidden behind the door of an ordinary hotel room, the case of Grace Millane was beginning to unfold. The following morning, the city of Auckland carried on as normal. Tourists checked out of hostels, flights departed from Auckland Airport, cafes filled with travellers planning their next destination. And somewhere inside the CityLife Hotel, investigators would later believe Grace Millane was already dead. But at that moment, nobody outside room 308 knew she was missing. Back in the United Kingdom, Grace's family expected to hear from her soon. The 2nd of December was not just another travel day, it was Grace's 22nd birthday. Messages began arriving from friends and relatives, birthday wishes, social media notifications, family messages from home. But unlike every previous occasion, Grace didn't reply. At first, the silence didn't immediately trigger panic. Grace was travelling internationally, time differences were confusing, backpackers often lost phone signal or became busy moving between locations. But as more time passed, the lack of contact began to feel wrong. Grace was known for staying in touch with family regularly, especially on important dates, especially birthdays. Her parents became increasingly worried. Calls went unanswered, messages remained unread, and slowly, concern began turning into fear. Meanwhile, inside Auckland, investigators would later reconstruct the movements of Jessie Shane Kempson after Grace's death in extraordinary detail. CCTV footage showed him leaving the CityLife Hotel multiple times over the following hours. According to prosecutors, he began carrying out a sequence of actions that appeared focused entirely on concealment. Investigators later alleged he searched online for ways to dispose of her body, rented a carpet cleaning machine, bought cleaning products, and purchased a large suitcase. CCTV would later capture Kempson moving through Auckland city centre with the suitcase. To most people watching the footage at the time, there was nothing immediately remarkable about it, just another man transporting luggage through a busy city. But investigators believed the suitcase contained Grace's body. The case would later become one of the clearest examples of how modern murder investigations are increasingly reconstructed through digital evidence. CCTV cameras, bank transactions, phone records, GPS data, internet searches. Almost every movement was leaving a trail. And detectives were beginning to realise the man at the centre of that trail was allegedly lying repeatedly. When police first spoke to Kempson, he reportedly claimed he and Grace had separated after their date. But investigators already possessed CCTV footage contradicting parts of his account. As pressure increased, his explanations changed. First one version of events, then another, then eventually the admission that Grace had died inside his apartment. But even then, he continued insisting her death had been accidental. Meanwhile, the missing person investigation surrounding Grace was escalating rapidly. Police publicly appealed for sightings. Media coverage spread across New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Grace's family travelled to Auckland desperate for answers. The emotional weight of those appeals would later become one of the defining memories of the case. Grace's father, David Millane, appeared before cameras visibly devastated as he asked for help finding his daughter. For many people watching internationally, it was heartbreaking, because while investigators were already moving toward a homicide investigation, Grace's family was still publicly pleading for her safe return. And behind the scenes, detectives were following evidence leading them away from central Auckland, towards dense woodland west of the city, the Waitākere Ranges. A vast area of forest and walking tracks stretching beyond Auckland's urban edge. It was there, investigators believed, the final stage of concealment had taken place. By the first week of December 2018, the investigation into the disappearance of Grace Millane was no longer being treated by police as a simple missing person case. Behind the scenes, detectives were already assembling what prosecutors would later describe as a detailed reconstruction of concealment and deception. And at the centre of that reconstruction was CCTV footage. Modern cities record almost everything. Hotel corridors, lifts, reception areas, car parks, petrol stations, road junctions, retail stores, and according to investigators, those cameras had quietly documented the movements of Jesse Shane Kempson after Grace's death almost step by step. Detectives alleged that after Grace died inside room 308, Kempson began attempting to clean the scene. Evidence presented later in court suggested he rented a carpet cleaning machine shortly afterwards. Investigators also linked him to purchases of cleaning supplies and other items prosecutors argued were connected to concealment efforts. Then came the suitcase. CCTV footage captured Kempson transporting a large suitcase through Auckland. To passing strangers, the images looked ordinary, a man handling luggage in a busy city centre, nothing more. But investigators believed the suitcase contained Grace's body. That detail became one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. Because unlike many murders hidden in isolated places, much of the alleged concealment happened in public. Surrounded by ordinary people, completely unaware of what they were witnessing. Police also reconstructed vehicle movements linked to the investigation. According to prosecutors, Kempson rented a car before travelling west out of Auckland. The destination was the Waitākere Ranges, a huge forest region of hills, bushland and walking tracks beyond the city outskirts. Beautiful, remote, quiet, the kind of place tourists visited for scenery and hiking. Investigators believed that somewhere within that landscape, Grace had been buried in a shallow grave. As forensic teams and police search units moved into the area, media attention exploded internationally. The disappearance of a young British backpacker abroad had already generated headlines, but now the tone of reporting changed completely. This was no longer a search for a missing tourist. It was becoming a murder investigation. Back in the UK, Grace's family were enduring every parent's nightmare in public view. Television crews followed developments constantly. New Zealand journalists camped outside court buildings and police briefings. And with every passing day, hope appeared to fade further. Then, on the 9th of December 2018, police made the announcement many had feared. Investigators had located a body in the Waitākere Ranges. The remains were later formally identified as Grace Millane. According to investigators, Grace had been buried in woodland after being transported from Auckland inside a suitcase. Shortly afterwards, Jessie Shane Kempson was charged with murder. The case immediately became one of the most high-profile criminal investigations in modern New Zealand history. But even as the country reacted with shock and anger, another major controversy was already beginning to emerge. Because while prosecutors believed the evidence pointed clearly toward murder, Kempson's defense team were preparing an argument that would divide public opinion across multiple countries. An argument centered around one claim: that Grace's death had been accidental. As news spread across New Zealand and the United Kingdom, the murder of Grace Millane quickly became more than a criminal investigation. It became a national conversation. A conversation about online dating, about violence against women, about consent, and about the increasingly controversial use of what became known as the rough sex defense. From the beginning, Jessie Shane Kempson did not deny Grace died inside his apartment. Instead, his legal team argued her death had been accidental. According to the defense, Grace had consented to sexual activity involving choking and restraint. They claimed Kempson panicked after she stopped breathing and then acted irrationally out of fear. That argument would become the centre of the entire trial, and it immediately triggered outrage both inside and outside New Zealand. Because prosecutors argued the evidence simply did not support an accident. When the trial began in Auckland High Court in November 2019, the courtroom became the focus of intense international media attention. Jurors were shown CCTV footage, forensic evidence, internet search history, pathology findings, witness testimony, and detailed reconstructions of Grace's final hours. The prosecution argued the physical evidence pointed clearly toward murder. Pathologist Dr. Simon Stables testified that Grace died from sustained pressure to the neck. Jurors heard evidence suggesting significant force had been used, compression lasted several minutes, and injuries were consistent with restraint. The prosecution argued this was not a momentary accident during consensual activity. They argued Grace had been intentionally killed. But one of the most controversial aspects of the trial involved the scrutiny placed upon Grace herself. Defense lawyers examined her Tinder use, her sexual history, private messages, and intimate details of her personal life. For many observers, the process felt deeply uncomfortable. Women's advocacy groups later criticised the trial for exposing Grace to intense posthumous scrutiny while she could no longer defend herself. Debates erupted internationally over whether so-called rough sex defences unfairly shifted attention toward victims rather than offenders. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued presenting evidence they said revealed deliberate concealment after Grace's death. Jurors heard about online searches, cleaning efforts, vehicle hire, the suitcase, and the burial site in the Waitākere Ranges. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing evidence involved Kempson's behaviour after Grace died. Prosecutors highlighted the allegation that while Grace's body remained inside the apartment, Kempson had gone on another Tinder date with a different woman. The details shocked the public, because to many people, it suggested not panic, but detachment, normality, an ability to compartmentalise events in a way investigators described as deeply disturbing. As the trial continued, additional testimony from women who had previously encountered Kempson also emerged. Some described aggressive sexual behaviour, controlling conduct, and experience involving choking during sex. The prosecution argued these accounts helped establish a wider behavioural pattern. Outside court, public interest became enormous. News outlets across Britain, Australia, and New Zealand covered developments daily. Social media debates intensified, and throughout it all, Grace's family sat through every detail of the evidence, listening as prosecutors reconstructed the final hours of their daughter's life in forensic detail. Then finally, after weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. The question now facing them was simple. Was Grace Millane's death a tragic accident during consensual sex? Or had Jessie Shane Kempson deliberately murdered her before attempting to cover up the crime? On the 22nd of November 2019, after weeks of evidence, testimony, and international media attention, the jury returned to the Auckland High Court. Inside the courtroom, silence settled over the public gallery. By that stage, the murder of Grace Millane had become one of the most closely followed criminal trials in modern New Zealand history. And now, after hearing arguments from both prosecution and defence, the jury had reached its decision. The deliberations had lasted only a few hours. Jessie Shane Kempson was found guilty of murder. For Grace's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but not relief, not closure, because no courtroom outcome could reverse what had happened. Grace was gone. Outside the court building, media from around the world waited for reactions. The case had touched people far beyond New Zealand because it represented something many found deeply unsettling. a young woman travelling alone, a dating app encounter, an apparently ordinary night out, and violence hidden behind normal social interaction. In February 2020, Kempson returned to court for sentencing. The judge described Grace's death as terrifying and cruel. He also condemned the efforts made to conceal her body afterwards. Kempson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. Appeals against both the conviction and sentence would later be dismissed. But even after the legal process concluded, the public conversation surrounding the case did not end, because Grace Millane's murder had exposed wider fears already growing internationally. Questions around coercive sexual behaviour, consent during violent acts, online dating safety, and the use of rough sex explanations in murder trials. Many campaigners argued the case reflected a dangerous pattern in which women killed by men during violent sexual encounters were increasingly portrayed as partly responsible for their own deaths. For others, the trial highlighted how female victims are often subjected to intense scrutiny after death. Messages, private relationships, sexual preferences, dating history, all examined publicly in ways many found deeply uncomfortable. And throughout all of it, Grace herself could no longer speak. One moment from the aftermath of the case would become internationally remembered, following the discovery of Grace's body. Then, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern addressed Grace's family publicly. She said, "Your daughter should have been safe here, and she wasn't." The statement resonated around the world, because for many people, it captured the heartbreak at the centre of the entire case. Grace had travelled to New Zealand searching for adventure, for independence, for experiences. Instead, her final journey ended in violence at the hands of somebody she had met only hours earlier. And perhaps what disturbed people most was how ordinary the beginning of that evening had looked. A Tinder date, a city bar, conversation, drinks, laughter caught on CCTV cameras. Nothing visibly unusual, nothing obviously dangerous, which is exactly why the case stayed with so many people afterwards, because it forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the most dangerous individuals do not appear threatening at all. The murder of Grace Millane became one of the defining international true crime cases of the modern digital age, not only because of the brutality of the crime itself, but because almost every stage of the investigation unfolded through technology. Dating apps, CCTV cameras, phone records, internet searches, GPS data, hotel keycards, digital footprints left behind silently at every stage. Investigators were able to reconstruct Grace's final hours in extraordinary detail. And yet, despite all that technology, despite surveillance cameras covering the city, despite forensic evidence and digital timelines, the most important reality remained painfully simple. Grace trusted the wrong person. That is what continues haunting so many people about the case years later. Because there was no dramatic kidnapping from a dark alley, no masked stranger hiding in shadows. Instead, danger arrived wearing ordinary clothes, making conversation across a bar table, blending perfectly into the normal world around it. The case also forced wider conversations around violence against women, particularly around the use of choking and coercive behaviour during sex. Campaigners later argued that rough sex explanations in courtrooms risked normalising dangerous violence while shifting scrutiny toward victims. And in the years following Grace's murder, several countries began debating legal reforms surrounding those defences. But beyond the headlines, beyond the politics, and beyond the courtroom arguments, there remained a family who lost their daughter. A young woman who never returned home from a trip that was supposed to mark the beginning of her adult life and independence. For many people, that is the image that remains strongest. Not the trial, not the CCTV footage, not the headlines, but Grace herself, smiling in travel photographs, exploring the world, looking toward the future, a future she would have had the chance to live. Because sometimes, what they hide is not hidden in darkness at all. Sometimes it hides behind charm, conversation, and the illusion of normality. That's where we're going to leave today's episode. If you've listened all the way through, thank you. Shout out this week to Connor in Belfast, Sarah in Melbourne, Jack in Toronto, and Ellie over in Bristol. Thank you all for supporting the show. You can find us on all socials at What They Hide Pod, and if you'd like to support the podcast directly, the Buy Me a Coffee link is available in the description below. And if you found this episode thoughtful or informative, make sure you're following or subscribed so you don't miss future releases. Because next time, we examine another hidden truth, another criminal case, and another story somebody hoped would stay buried. But for now, this is where the story ends.